an important question might be, and why would these people be motivated? Why would they have a motivation to forget about it? What do they stand to gain by forgetting about the historical critical method of the Bible? Or what do they stand to lose by hanging on to it? Right. They might mess about with the faith of their congregation. If their congregation has a conservative view of what's in the Bible, it could mess with them. And maybe good ministers aren't supposed to do that according to the way they feel about it, right? So maybe they don't want to mess with their congregation. That's a pretty big thing, right? If it's your job to lead the congregation in what they see as their faith, if you start doing something that looks like attacking their faith, you might lose your job. Ehrman is in fact surprised when he explains this. He was invited to teach at a Sunday school or something like that. He gave a 4-week series on the historical Jesus at this church because he was invited by a friend who was a minister. And at the end of it, some lady came up to him and said, "Why have I never heard this stuff before? Why did I never hear about it?" And Ehrman's confused because Ehrman's like, "I don't know, because your pastor went to the same school that I went to and learned the exact same stuff that I learned. I don't know why you don't know it." He goes on, and look on... Well, if you look on 14, right around the middle of the page on 14, just below the center, he says, "The information and perspectives I present in the class," he's talking about the class that he teaches at his college, "are nothing radical. They are the views found among critical scholars who approach the Bible historically, whether the scholars themselves are believers or non-believers, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, agnostic, or whatever else." These are not like extremist views that he's presenting in his class or in his textbook. These are generally kind of par for the course types of things. He goes on, if you look on the bottom of 17. I want to look at the last paragraph on 17. This is kind of his conclusion to his introduction. He says, "All of my closest friends in the Guild of the New Testament Studies agree with most of my historical views of the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the development of the Christian faith and other similar issues. We may disagree on this point or that. In fact, we do. We are, after all, scholars. But we all agree on the historical methods and basic conclusions they lead to." Now, the reason why I want to bring that up is that in the textbook that you've been reading by Ehrman and in the things that he discusses here, he's not presenting something that's like on the fringe of the New Testament academy. This is mainstream stuff in the academy. If you are a scholar going to get a PhD in biblical studies, you'll learn this sort of stuff on day one, or they'll even presume that you already know it and move on to other types of things. This is basic, taken for granted stuff. And the reason why Ehrman writes this book is because he's frustrated that everything that all of him and his colleagues in New Testament studies take for granted, nobody seems to know about outside New Testament studies. He goes on to talk about this distinction between vertical and horizontal reading. Now, what's the difference here between vertical and horizontal reading? I'd love for somebody other than Kristen to say. Anybody have an idea? He brings up this difference when he's trying to explain why people might not notice these sorts of contradictions. He suggests that they might not notice because they do vertical readings instead of horizontal readings. What does this even mean? Jim? Lauren?
I think you put like the different pieces like right next to each other, and then just like compare them to there.
That's which of these?
Horizontal.
Yeah, that's the horizontal reading, right? Vertical reading, he suggests, is when you just start at the top of the page and read down. Start at the top of the next page, read down. So you read Matthew, then you read Mark, then you read Luke, then you read John, etc. Just boom, boom, boom down the line. Horizontal reading is more like what we did. Do you remember when I pulled out that page from the synoptic comparison book where it showed side by side all the different passages? Like we looked at the we looked at the, what did we look at? The baptism of Jesus. And we looked at the passage where it showed this is what Mark says, this is what Luke says, this is what Matthew says. Side by side. That is horizontal reading. Comparing one next to the other, next to the other. And Ehrman points out that most people don't do what he's calling horizontal reading. And you're less likely to notice the contradictions unless you're doing that. Right? You remember when we looked at the Matthew, Mark, and Luke on Jesus' baptism, right? One says that John baptized Jesus. The other says that John asked permission. And the other says that John was in jail. If we read the Gospels in order, by the time we got to the next one, we might have forgotten what happened. But looking at them side by side, it's glaringly obvious that they're different from one another. Which is why you're more apt to notice these things if you take the horizontal reading. Now, in the second chapter, I wanted to discuss 3 specific examples of contradictions that are a little bit more substantial than the ones we already looked at. But since apparently most of you haven't done the reading or don't remember the reading, you're responsible on your own for looking at what I was going to cover. Going to talk about the discrepancies in the Passover and how those might be significant, the discrepancies in the birth stories and how those might be significant, and the differences in the genealogy and how those might be significant. Now, I'm not going to lecture on them. You are responsible for looking at chapter 2 and figuring out those things for yourself. I'm going to go on to ask some discussion questions. FYI, these things should be familiar because we talked about this when we read John. We talked about this when we read Matthew. We talked about that when we read Matthew. So it shouldn't be alien. It should be familiar. But you're responsible for looking it up. You guys are going to have read the next chapter by Wednesday, right? Raise your hand if you intend to read the next chapter and come prepared to discuss it. Excellent news. Okay. Why might the type of research that Ehrman is doing, and that, as he points out, this is mainstream biblical studies, why might this be threatening?